At first, the avoidant doesn't think there's anything special about this connection. In their mind, they've seen this story before. Someone enters their life, feelings begin to grow, emotional closeness increases, and eventually the same pattern unfolds. The other person starts wanting more time, more reassurance, more certainty, and more emotional access. The avoidant already knows how this usually ends because they've lived it so many times before. So, when they begin getting close to a healed empath, they unconsciously prepare for the same cycle. They expect that if they become a little distant, the other person will become more interested. If they take longer to respond, the other person will start overthinking. If they pull away emotionally, the other person will try harder to reconnect. And for most of their past relationships, that's exactly what happened. Distance created pursuit. Silence created anxiety. Uncertainty created emotional chasing. But this time, something feels different. The avoidant pulls back slightly, waiting for the familiar reaction. And nothing happens. No emotional pressure, no desperate attempts to reconnect. No flood of messages demanding answers. The healed empath notices the distance, but they don't lose themselves because of it. They don't panic. They don't chase. They don't make the avoidant the center of their emotional universe. At first, the avoidant may even feel relieved. After all, they got the space they wanted. There is no conflict, no pressure, no emotional drama. But then something unexpected begins happening. The space doesn't feel the way it normally does. Because in most situations, when an avoidant creates distance, their attention becomes occupied by managing the other person's reaction. They're focused on the texts, the questions, the emotional conversations, and the pressure that follows. Now none of that exists. The healed empath simply continues living their life. They continue growing. They continue focusing on themselves. They continue moving forward. And suddenly the avoidant is left alone with something they rarely experience. Silence, real silence. Not the silence of escaping someone. The silence of realizing someone isn't chasing. This is where curiosity begins to appear. Because human beings are naturally drawn toward what they don't fully understand. The avoidant starts wondering why the usual pattern isn't happening. Why isn't this person reacting? Why aren't they trying harder? Why do they seem okay? What changed? These questions become difficult to ignore because they challenge the avoidant's expectations. For perhaps the first time, distance isn't creating control, it's creating uncertainty. And uncertainty captures attention. What's fascinating is that the healed empath isn't trying to create this effect. They're not playing games. They're not pretending to be detached. They're simply secure enough to understand that another person's withdrawal is not a reflection of their worth. That emotional stability changes everything, because the avoidant can feel the difference. Most people unknowingly communicate, "Please don't leave me." The healed empath communicates something entirely different. Their energy says, "I care about you, but I won't abandon myself to keep you." And that message carries enormous psychological weight. The avoidant begins sensing that this is not someone who can be controlled through distance. This is not someone who will sacrifice their self-respect for connection. This is not someone who becomes more available the less available they receive. Instead, they're dealing with someone who remains emotionally open while also remaining emotionally grounded. And that's rare. Very rare. The more the avoidant observes this, the more their usual strategies lose power. The distance that once created pursuit now creates reflection. The silence that once created anxiety now creates mystery. The withdrawal that once guaranteed control now leaves them wondering what they're missing. Without realizing it, the avoidant starts paying closer attention. Not because they were forced to, not because they were chased, but because for the first time, they've met someone who refuses to chase them into connection and is completely willing to keep growing with or without them. And sometimes that's the exact moment an avoidant becomes more emotionally invested than they ever expected. At first, the avoidant can't quite explain why this person feels different. On the surface, everything seems normal. The healed empath is kind, they're caring, they're emotionally available. But there is something unusual about the way they show up in the relationship, and the avoidant senses it long before they fully understand it. Most avoidants enter relationships expecting a familiar sequence of events. In the beginning, everything feels easy. The connection grows naturally. The other person appreciates them. Attraction develops. But somewhere along the way, the avoidant usually begins noticing subtle changes. Expectations start increasing. Emotional needs become more visible. Conversations become heavier. The relationship starts feeling like something they have to manage rather than simply experience. Whether those fears are accurate or not doesn't always matter. What matters is that the avoidant expects them. They expect pressure. They expect demands. They expect responsibility. And because they expect these things, they're constantly scanning for signs that they're about to appear. This is why even healthy closeness can sometimes make an avoidant uncomfortable. The closer someone gets, the more they start wondering when the pressure will begin. When will the expectations increase? When will the demands show up? When will the relationship start feeling overwhelming? Then they meet a healed empath, and something unexpected happens. The pressure never arrives. The healed empath cares deeply, but they don't cling. They listen carefully, but they don't interrogate. They offer support, but they don't make the avoidant responsible for their emotional well-being. At first, the avoidant doesn't know what to do with this experience because it doesn't fit the story they've been carrying for years. They're waiting for the hidden condition. They're waiting for the emotional contract. They're waiting for the moment when kindness turns into control, but it never comes. And that's where the confusion begins. The healed empath has already learned one of the hardest lessons in relationships. Love and attachment are not the same thing. They can love someone deeply without making that person responsible for their happiness. They can care without controlling. They can stay emotionally present without demanding constant reassurance. That emotional freedom creates an atmosphere the avoidant rarely experiences. For perhaps the first time, they're around someone who isn't trying to pull them closer every time they take a step back. Someone who doesn't interpret every moment of distance as rejection. Someone who doesn't need constant proof of love to feel secure. And because of that, the avoidance nervous system begins relaxing in ways it normally wouldn't. The walls are still there, the defenses are still there, but they're not being activated as often. Think about it from the avoidance perspective. For years, they've associated relationships with pressure. Pressure to respond, pressure to explain, pressure to meet expectations, pressure to provide emotional certainty. Now they're encountering someone who removes much of that pressure without removing the connection itself. That's what makes the experience so powerful, because most avoidants assume they must choose between two extremes. Either they keep their freedom and sacrifice intimacy, or they accept intimacy and sacrifice their freedom. The healed empath quietly demonstrates a third possibility, a relationship where both can exist together. A relationship where closeness doesn't automatically lead to control. A relationship where understanding doesn't come with hidden demands. A relationship where love doesn't feel like an obligation. And the more the avoidant experiences this, the harder it becomes to hold on to their old beliefs. Something inside them starts questioning the assumptions they've always made. Maybe closeness isn't the problem. Maybe vulnerability isn't the problem. Maybe the problem was never intimacy itself. Maybe the problem was the kind of intimacy they experienced before. This realization doesn't happen overnight. In fact, it often unfolds slowly. One conversation at a time, one interaction at a time, one moment of unexpected safety at a time. But eventually the avoidant notices something they never expected. They're not spending their energy looking for an escape route. They're not calculating how much distance they need. They're not preparing for emotional overwhelm. Instead, they're simply present. And for someone who has spent years protecting themselves from connection, that feeling can be both unfamiliar and incredibly powerful. Because sometimes the most life-changing experience for an avoidant is discovering that love can feel safe without ever feeling like a trap. The deeper this connection becomes, the more something unusual starts happening inside the avoidant's mind. At first, they notice that the healed empath doesn't react like other people. Then they notice that the relationship feels safer than expected. But eventually, they begin experiencing something even more unsettling. They start feeling seen. And for many avoidants, being truly seen is both one of their deepest desires and one of their greatest fears. Most people only see the surface version of an avoidant. They see someone independent, someone who seems emotionally controlled, someone who rarely needs help, someone who appears comfortable handling life on their own. And to be fair, the avoidant often works very hard to maintain that image, not because they're fake, not because they're dishonest, but because they've spent years learning that vulnerability can be risky. Somewhere along the way, they learned that exposing too much of themselves could lead to disappointment, rejection, criticism, or emotional pain. So they adapted. They became self-reliant. They learned to keep certain feelings private. They learned to appear unaffected, even when something mattered deeply. Over time, these behaviors became automatic. The mask became so familiar that even the avoidant sometimes forgot it was there. Then they meet a healed empath, and unlike most people, the healed empath doesn't become distracted by the surface. They pay attention to what exists underneath. When the avoidant suddenly becomes distant, the healed empath doesn't immediately assume they don't care. When they withdraw during emotional moments, the healed empath doesn't instantly label them as cold. When they avoid vulnerability, the healed empath notices the discomfort hiding behind the behavior. This creates a strange experience for the avoidant. Because for the first time in a long time, someone seems to understand things they never actually explained. The healed empath notices the hesitation before a vulnerable conversation. They notice the emotional walls that appear whenever things become too close. They notice the fear hidden behind the need for space. And the avoidant begins wondering something they rarely ask themselves. How are they seeing this? Because most people react to the behavior. The healed empath notices the reason behind the behavior. That's what makes the connection feel different. The avoidant may spend years convincing the world that they don't need anyone. Yet the healed empath quietly notices the loneliness behind that independence. The avoidant may act completely unbothered after creating distance. Yet the healed empath senses the internal conflict they're trying not to show. The avoidant may insist they're fine. Yet the healed empath notices the emotions hiding underneath the words. And while part of the avoidant finds this comforting, another part becomes nervous. Because understanding creates visibility, that vifidizen creates vulnerability. And vulnerability is exactly what they've spent years trying to avoid. For a while, they may try to retreat back into familiar patterns. They may become more distant, more guarded, more careful. But something has already changed. The healed empath has seen beyond the performance, not in a judgmental way, not in a controlling way, simply in an honest way. And once someone feels genuinely understood, it's difficult to return to relationships where they feel misunderstood. That's why this stage often becomes a turning point. The avoidant starts realizing that this person isn't connecting with the image they've created. They're connecting with the real person underneath it. The fears, the doubts, the insecurities, the hopes they've rarely spoken aloud. And that realization can be surprisingly emotional. Because most people spend their lives hoping someone will understand them, yet when it finally happens, it can feel almost overwhelming. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant begins experiencing what it's like to be accepted, without needing to pretend, without needing to perform, and without needing to hide behind the version of themselves they've shown the world for years. And once someone experiences that kind of understanding, walking away from it becomes far more difficult than they ever imagined. For most of their life, the avoidant has believed a story that feels completely true. It isn't a story they necessarily tell other people. In many cases, they don't even realize they're carrying it. but it influences almost every relationship decision they make. The story goes something like this. The closer I get to someone, the more freedom I lose, the more emotionally invested I become, the more trapped I'll feel, the more someone loves me, the more they'll expect from me. And because this belief has been reinforced over years of experiences, disappointments, and emotional defenses, it starts feeling like a fact rather than a fear. That's why many avoidants keep one foot near the exit. Even when they're happy, even when they care deeply, even when the relationship is healthy, a part of them remains alert, watching, waiting, preparing for the moment when closeness turns into pressure. Then they meet a healed empath, and at first, they assume this relationship will eventually prove them right. After all, every relationship starts out easy. Every relationship feels comfortable in the beginning. The avoidant expects the familiar shift to arrive sooner or later. They expect the healed empath to become more demanding. They expect emotional dependency to appear. They expect their independence to slowly disappear. But something strange happens. Weeks pass, months pass, and the pattern never arrives. The healed empath continues loving without controlling. They continue caring without becoming possessive. They continue creating connection without trying to manage every aspect of the relationship. This is where the avoidant begins experiencing something that quietly shakes their entire worldview. For the first time, they're witnessing a person who doesn't need to control what they love. Most people don't realize how deeply this affects an avoidant, because the avoidant isn't just evaluating the relationship. They're evaluating a belief system they've carried for years. Every interaction becomes evidence. Every conversation becomes evidence. Every moment of freedom becomes evidence. The healed empath isn't demanding constant updates. They aren't creating drama to feel important. They aren't treating independence like a threat. Instead, they seem completely comfortable allowing connection and freedom to exist at the same time. That idea feels almost impossible to the avoidant because their past experiences taught them the opposite. They learned that closeness eventually becomes obligation. That vulnerability eventually becomes weakness. That commitment eventually becomes pressure. Now they're standing in front of someone who challenges every one of those assumptions without saying a word. The healed empath isn't trying to teach a lesson. They're simply living differently. And that's what makes the impact so powerful, because people rarely change their beliefs through arguments. They change them through experiences. The avoidant begins noticing that they don't feel trapped. They notice they can ask for space without creating chaos. They notice they can be imperfect without being punished. They notice they can remain themselves without disappointing the other person. Slowly, almost without realizing it, they start lowering defenses they thought were necessary, not because someone convinced them to. Because reality is showing them something new. And that's where the real internal conflict begins. Because once an avoidant sees evidence that contradicts an old belief, they face a difficult choice: hold on to the belief, or question it. If they question it, an uncomfortable possibility emerges. What if freedom and love were never enemies? What if independence and intimacy were never opposites? What if the walls they've spent years protecting were built around a fear that no longer reflects reality? Those questions can be deeply unsettling, because questioning a relationship is easy. Questioning your entire understanding of relationships is much harder, yet that's exactly what starts happening. The healed empath becomes living proof that love doesn't have to demand ownership. That closeness doesn't have to eliminate individuality. That connection doesn't have to come at the cost of freedom. And for an avoidant, discovering that possibility can feel like watching a lifelong belief slowly fall apart right in front of them. Because the most powerful thing a healed empath often gives an avoidant isn't reassurance. It's evidence that the love they've always feared may not be the love that's standing in front of them. For a long time, the avoidant has been able to focus on external problems. Relationships ended because the other person was too needy, too emotional, too demanding, too controlling, too much. Whether those perceptions were completely accurate or not, they gave the avoidant a clear explanation for why distance felt necessary. Then they meet a healed empath, and something unexpected happens. The usual emotional chaos never appears. There are no dramatic accusations, no guilt trips, no desperate attempts to force closeness, no constant emotional storms pulling the relationship off course. And because those distractions are missing, the avoidant loses one of the easiest places to focus their attention. Instead of concentrating on the other person's reactions, they begin noticing their own. For perhaps the first time, their patterns become harder to ignore. They notice how quickly they pull away when intimacy deepens. They notice how uncomfortable vulnerability feels. They notice how often they interpret closeness as pressure, even when no pressure is being applied. And this realization doesn't come through criticism. That's the important part. If the healed empath attacked them, blamed them, or tried to prove them wrong, the avoidant would likely become defensive. They would protect themselves. They would explain, justify, and withdraw. But the healed empath doesn't create that battle. They simply remain emotionally steady. And emotional steadiness acts like a mirror. Imagine standing in front of a calm lake. When the water is still, you can see your reflection clearly. When the water is chaotic, the reflection disappears. In the same way, the healed empath's calm presence makes the avoidant's own behavior more visible. Without drama to react to, the avoidant starts observing themselves. Why did I pull away after that conversation? Why did I feel trapped when nothing was actually trapping me? Why do I keep creating distance with people who care about me? These questions can be deeply uncomfortable because they shift the focus inward. For years, the avoidant may have believed that the problem was always outside of them, the wrong partners, the wrong timing, the wrong circumstances. But the healed empath's stability makes another possibility impossible to ignore. What if some of the struggle is coming from the defenses they've built to protect themselves? That realization can feel unsettling, because defenses that once felt necessary begin looking different under clear light. The withdrawal that felt like independence starts looking like fear. The emotional distance that felt like strength starts looking like protection. The need for control starts looking like anxiety about vulnerability. And again, the healed empath doesn't force these conclusions. They don't diagnose. They don't shame. They don't say, "You're avoidant, and here's what's wrong with you." They simply create a relationship where the usual excuses no longer fit. When someone remains calm, respectful, emotionally available, and non-controlling, it becomes much harder to blame the relationship itself for every uncomfortable feeling. The avoidant is left face-to-face with their own emotional habits. This is why the healed empath can become such a powerful catalyst for self-awareness. Not because they rescue the avoidant, not because they fix the avoidant, but because their presence removes enough noise for the avoidant to finally hear themselves. And once someone begins seeing their own patterns clearly, those patterns become much harder to deny. For many avoidants, this is the moment the relationship stops being just about another person and starts becoming a mirror, reflecting parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. And that reflection can be one of the most uncomfortable and transformative experiences they ever face. As the connection continues to grow, something begins happening that the avoidant never planned for. In the beginning, they believed they were in control of the situation. If things became too intense, they could create space. If emotions became overwhelming, they could step back. If the relationship ever felt uncomfortable, they could always leave. That belief had protected them for years. The ability to walk away felt like freedom. The ability to disconnect felt like safety. The ability to create distance felt like control. But this relationship is different, because the person standing in front of them isn't desperately trying to be chosen. The healed empath isn't waiting to be rescued. They aren't sitting around hoping the avoidant will finally decide to commit. They already have a life. They already have purpose. They already have emotional stability. And that changes everything. At first, the avoidant finds this attractive, the confidence, the independence, the emotional maturity. But over time, they begin realizing something far more significant. This person is capable of leaving too. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, not because they stopped caring, but because they respect themselves enough not to wait forever. And that realization quietly introduces a fear the avoidant rarely allows themselves to feel: loss, real loss. For most of the relationship, the avoidant assumed the healed empath would remain available. Maybe not forever, but long enough. Long enough for them to figure things out. Long enough to keep one foot in the relationship while deciding what they wanted. But the healed empath doesn't live that way. They understand something the avoidant is only beginning to learn. Love cannot survive where growth is constantly postponed. Connection cannot deepen when one person is always standing still. And eventually, if nothing changes, the healed empath keeps moving forward, not because they stopped loving, because they started choosing themselves. This is where the avoidant often experiences their greatest internal conflict. For the first time, they realize they may actually lose someone who understands them, not the version they show the world, the real version. The version hidden beneath the defenses, the version hidden beneath the independence, the version hidden beneath the emotional walls. The healed empath saw all of it and somehow stayed. That's what makes the realization so painful, because people who truly understand us are incredibly rare. Many people know our stories. Very few people understand our fears. Many people see our behavior. Very few people see the wounds behind the behavior. The healed empath saw both, and now that connection feels uncertain. The avoidant begins replaying memories differently. Conversations that once seemed ordinary suddenly feel meaningful. Moments of understanding become impossible to forget. The emotional safety they once took for granted starts looking irreplaceable. And perhaps for the first time, they stop asking, "What am I risking by getting closer?" and start asking a completely different question. What am I risking by staying distant? That question changes everything, because now the fear is no longer intimacy. The fear is regret. The fear is realizing too late what they had. The fear is watching someone rare walk away while they remain trapped inside the same protective patterns that once felt safe. And here's the irony. The healed empath never tried to create this realization. They never forced it. They never manipulated it. They never chased it. They simply continued growing, continued healing, continued building a meaningful life. And in doing so, they became living proof that healthy love doesn't wait forever for someone to be ready. At some point, it keeps moving. And when the avoidant finally sees that possibility clearly, they come face to face with a truth that can shake them to their core. Finding someone who truly understands you is rare. Finding someone who understands you and still chooses you is even rarer. And losing that person may become the one distance they never wanted to create in the first place.